Welcome back to the channel. It's time to run down the very worst eras in the history of X-Men. We're in the Krakoan era. There's a good chance this one's going to be number one, but there's been some absolute dead eras following Chris Claremont's pristine run on Uncanny X-Men, the best run in comic book history. I brought in the X-Men historian himself, Doc, to run it down. How you doing, Doc?
I am good. Thank you for having me.
Doc, you were going to mess with some people right out the gate. I think a lot of people thought this would be vying for number one with the Krakoan era, but you're saying honorable mention doesn't make the top five, but worth mentioning is the Chuck Austen era.
And there's one main thing behind that. Almost all of the rest of the line was actually pretty good at the time. You could seek refuge from what he was doing in at least one or two other books at the time. His biggest sins were Sammy the Fish Boy and Husk and Angel fucking in the air over top of her mom, which is kind of weird and creepy and gross. But if that's your worst sin, it doesn't even crack the top five worst for me.
All right, so people are going to be intrigued now. I'm sure they expected Chuck Austen to be in there. Let's go to number five. This was a big event and really one of the downfalls of Marvel Comics in modern times. One of the events that really let you know events didn't matter anymore. Avengers versus X-Men seems like a cool concept, but in execution was absolutely pitiful.
There's a lot of reasons for it. You have the fundamental misunderstanding of the Phoenix Force. You have obviously the Cyclops killing Xavier thing. Well, you had the Dad Vereen with Wolverine being on both sides and him somehow being the main character. But I think its biggest sin, it was the start of a trope that's happened for the last good number of years. The X-Men somehow come in, solve a massive problem, make the world better, somehow are the villains for it. In Avengers versus X-Men, they actually fix the fucking world. Like, it eliminates bigotry and prejudice, gives everybody a safe world to live in, reduces conflict, and of course the Avengers have to fix it. How do you fix it? By bringing back bigotry and racism to mutants? Okay, I guess. Is that a fix? No, I think that is its biggest failure. It was something that got repeated and repeated and repeated after this. You know, it did to Cyclops the same thing that Civil War did to Iron Man, where you could have had a just genuine philosophical conflict between the Avengers and the X-Men, but you had to go too far and make Cyclops the villain the same way that you had to go too far and make Iron Man doing devious fucking terrible shit. That would have been so much better if there was not a delineated good guy and bad guy.
Probably would have worked better that way, but we could only wish that they could go back and do that, although it does feel like they're moving towards Avengers versus X-Men number 2. I wouldn't be surprised if we get that within the next couple of years. Let's go now to the fourth worst era in X-Men history. And I think this one should be vying for number one as well. I think you're grading this one too low, Doc. The X-Men Colors era. Gold, red, and blue. Red is especially bad from Tom Taylor. This is the comic book that brought us Mustard and Bigotry or Hot Dogs and Bigotry. One or the other from Nightcrawler. Just terrible stuff.
Yeah, it was the Mustard and Bigotry in X-Men Red, which was a atrocious, terrible comic. It was another case that involved beating the villain by making them feel bad. The Colors era, it would have occasionally there'd be some decent issues of blue or decent issues of gold. There were no redeeming issues of red. It was the worst fucking X-Men comic ever written. Was until now. There was some refuge. You could go to some of the there was a lot of solo character spin-off books that weren't bad around that era where you could jump from book to book. You could theoretically make the argument that the Chuck Austen era is about the same as this. Yes. The thing was, it took a lot of the stuff from one that's a little higher on this and made it worse. Because you had the original 5 team running around today, you know, bringing the original 5 to the future. Whatever would happen to them mattered to like their present day selves. They got rid of that during the Color era. And you'd think that would open up more storytelling possibilities. In fact, it just made it blander. What you really needed was the original 5 X-Men of the Color era running around in a van to do a road trip comic. That was their big hook for that era. Come on. Fuck you.
We got the end of Brian Michael Bendis when we were at Marvel Comics. A lot of people say that Civil War 2 is the worst thing that he ever did at Marvel Comics. I think maybe his X-Men run is absolutely worse, Doc.
This is actually worse than the color era because he's the one that brought the original 5 X-Men to the present. He took all the worst things that were the fallout in AVX, such as making, Cyclops into, mutant Hitler, having him basically become the new Magneto. Uncanny wasn't bad. It was an X-Men on the run thing, but it was Cyclops leading a team of villains from a Weapon X facility. Not terrible, but also not very good. The big book, though, the kind of marquee book of the line at the time was All New X-Men. The big hook there was we brought the original 5 X-Men back to the present. It wasn't a terrible idea for just a story arc, but the fact that they made it into a long era-defining plot mechanism, you realized by about 6 or 8 issues in, nothing in this story can have any stakes at all because they're not going to get rid of the adult version of any of these characters. The only thing that took from that era was Jean Grey turning Bobby gay. That's it. That's it.
The biggest moment people remember.
That's all you got from the entire Bendis era. There was nothing really redeeming and nothing in it could matter.
A lot of that happens with Brian Michael Bendis' writing these days. One time he had it, and then all of a sudden he didn't have it, and he hasn't had it for quite some time. Let's move over to a worse writer, in my opinion. Somebody whose sole purpose at Marvel Comics is to take things other people created, great things, and absolutely destroy them by going back and retconning this shit out of every single character, universe, team that he can get his hands on. The Jason Aaron era of X-Men. Absolutely terrible. Comes in at number 2.
You got the Schism story, the big split between Cyclops and Wolverine. They both take the wrong fucking side of the argument because Jason Aaron's a fanboy, and he's the one that truly and 100% created Dadverine. Everything about the fundamental way that the X-Men worked, everybody took the wrong sides. Wolverine suddenly, he was always the one that wanted the Teenage Mutants. He's the one that ran Jubilee's training. He's the one that made Shadowcat learn how to fight and took her to Japan and trained her to be a fucking ninja. They need to be able to protect themselves. Yet the whole thing in Schism was the kids shouldn't fight. That was Wolverine's opinion. Cyclops suddenly being perfectly okay with a team of child soldiers. And everything after that was just consequences of this. It was fundamental change of the way that the X-Men work. For the longest time, the whole point of the X-Men was they were a strike force. Xavier brought them to the school and trained them, let them live for free, gave them access to all kinds of tools and technology and education and all this other stuff. There was a simple kind of implied trade-off. You had to be able to fight for Xavier's dream. He took something that Grant Morrison fucked up and made it even worse, adding all the characters that should have been just Morlocks. He brought them and made them center stage. So instead of it just being mutants that with functional, useful superhero powers, it was a bunch of useless mutants like fucking Eye-Boy.
Definitely a forgettable era in X-Men, and really anything Jason Aaron does ends up being a forgettable era of everything in Marvel Comics. Look at his store run. Started out pretty good. Everybody wishes it never happened at this point. Now let's talk about the number 1 worst era in all of X-Men comic book history. It has to be the Krakoan era. Started out like a House of Fire, House of X, Powers of 10, absolutely amazing. A couple of strong series out the gate that were really good. Hellions, the X-Men series, there were a couple other things. Wolverine started out well. X-Force started out well. And then it just all died. The thing that really separates this era from every other era, in my opinion, Doc, is just the amount of bad. It's overwhelmingly bad across the line.
There is no refuge from the storm at this point. And look, even during the Hickman, when Hickman was still there, we could say that his leaving was the catalyst for it to go badly. And I guess you could argue that, but at the same time, even when he was there, probably only a quarter of the books that even he wrote fucking mattered because he spent all of his time treading water, waiting for a bunch of other clowns to catch up with the plot advancement. And then they never did. It went from 2 really good titles to 1 really good title, a couple of good titles, and some mediocre ones. And it's just devolved every month in quality since then to the point where the line itself is unreadable. You're not resolving any of the big plots. They just addressed a couple of flashbacks that happened in some of the books. Nothing else matters. There is an absurd number of events. We finish one event to move into another. There's no carryover. There's no holdover. It's just event to event to event. The stakes vanish and diminish with every possible event. We've started with little stakes and ended up at no stakes. Nobody cares anymore. What is the impetus to read if the thing you read doesn't matter by the time you're done with it?
Recently, Doc and I went a little bit more in depth about everything wrong with the Krakoan era and the 5 things that really stand out about why that is the worst era in the history of X-Men. Definitely check this one out. I made this video specifically for you. If you don't see it here, there's also a link in the video description.